Um, I think we're live here. Well, go ahead, John. You can introduce us and introduce our charming topic today.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm John Euler. Jimmy Hinton is my partner. We are Church Protect, and thank you for joining our webinar. This is part 2 of what we started yesterday, which was an introduction during which we introduced the topic of really the difference between what most people assume are the character qualities of a perpetrator versus what we are calling a super predator. It will probably generate a lot of controversy, the use of that term by us, but Jimmy and I are knowledgeable enough and we have become educated enough to where we're willing to have that discussion. So unless someone can prove anything to the contrary, we are going to label the individuals that we're talking about as super predators. And that's important for all of us to understand, because this is not the typical individual that we look for as far as the red flags that we're all informed of. These are individuals. So Church Protect, Jimmy and I are concerned about, and we are focused on those individuals that are wolves in sheep's clothing, that are coming into the church, that the church is not prepared for, church leaders are not prepared for, because we're looking for the wrong animal. And the greatest damage is perpetrated by a unique type of individual that we're calling the super predator. We're here to describe that, because until we can identify the enemy, we are we're no good and we're ineffective, and there's too much on the line. We're talking the lives of kids, we're talking the lives of people who have been affected by this. Conservatively, about 40% of women, very conservatively, probably 15% of men have been perpetrated against, which means in any given congregation, though a pastor may not know much about his congregation, ideally he does, the one thing he is guaranteed of is looking out over his congregation. Nearly 40%, probably 40% of those that are looking back at him have been perpetrated against in one way or another. That means he has a tremendous amount of individuals who are walking wounded, and unless he can assist those who have been injured in that fashion, they are not going to be able to fully attend to what he's saying in the sermon. Certain things are going to be triggering them, and they are going to be, they're going to walk out in a way the same as they walked in. And so we are concerned that these super predators are being welcomed into the church. We know they are. And it's not just in the church, it's camps. Jimmy today found out about the president of a Christian camp who has been perpetrating against boys. Unfortunately, that's very common, and people are giving those predators a pass. So we're here today to talk about the nature of, kind of part 2, the nature of a super predator. What are the characteristics, and is it by accident that these individuals have come to be the way they are, or is it a complete level of deviance? Jimmy, you want to?
I wanted to add to that. You know, that as John mentioned, I just fielded a phone call right before we started this webinar, and this is, you know, it's not a coincidental thing. We field these phone calls routinely, and so this was a particular case of a couple different churches had reached out to me based on this kind of material that we're presenting today. And it wasn't until I had presented this material, they said, there are certain things that we're starting to see in this individual, and what are your thoughts? So I had received, kind of ironically, 2 different phone calls from 2 different people about the same individual. And so we started to see a pattern that was emerging. And here, this guy's been involved in closely involved in a Christian camp for decades. We're talking over 40 years. And all of a sudden, not until 2016, have people started to put the pieces together. And lo and behold, today the first victim, I was informed, came forward. And hopefully this launches an investigation, but my suspicion is that this man has hundreds of victims. So how do these people, oh, I think my camera just went out.
Well, you can
Am I correct?
Talking. You can keep talking, Jimmy, while we're trying to adjust that.
There we go. Should be back now.
Yep.
Okay. So, you know, we're not talking about people who aren't respected and people who they just slip up and you know, they make a mistake every now and then. This is somebody who for over 40 years has been producing victims while serving on the board of directors at a Christian camp at the very place where he's producing his victims. So, you know, I think that can launch pretty nicely, John, into this first presentation. I don't know if you want to pull that up now and just kind of walk through some of these things, but
let's do it. Let's get into the nature of the super predator. We emphasized last week that, and we've just done that again, that these are not the creepy people in a trench coat that just walk into a church. This category of individuals that we are talking about have made their way into and will make their way into leadership positions, and they are among us, and they are the most dangerous. It doesn't mean we're out to do a witch hunt. It means that people that more than likely are least suspected, and again, we're not out to do a witch hunt, but how these perpetrators continue is that they are the ultimate con men, and they are the people that one would least suspect. And so when victims do come forward, the natural reaction is for people to minimize or negate what the victim is saying. And the reality is very few people are interested in being labeled as a victim of sexual abuse.
Well, and I would add to that, you know, this case that we're talking about this morning that I was tipped off, this victim did tell, and not only was it minimized, but he was forced to forgive the perpetrator literally hours after the abuse took place. And so the perception was that because the abuser was caught and shed the alligator tears, that he was remorseful, and the abuse continued for years with that same victim. So, you know, and this is routine. John and I, you know, we do this enough, and we've seen it enough and worked with enough perpetrators, and John has worked with literally thousands of them. I've interviewed multiple people who've worked with thousands of predators, these super predators we're talking about, and every single one of them says the same thing. They do not change. They will not stop. Death is the only thing that will stop them. So, John, I'll let you walk through some of these here.
We're sticking with the theme of super predator, and so you will kind of see that as we go through this this chart that speaks to the issue, and this is probably one of the most challenging issues for any of us, which is this: when any of us are dealing with somebody that has significantly negatively impacted a victim or someone else, there's a part of us that does not want to ascribe responsibility. I think because we're inclined to give the benefit of the doubt, and that's a good thing, but we better make sure we do not have misplaced sympathies, depending upon who we're dealing with. For instance, if you're dealing with the run-of-the-mill person and there's an involuntary murder situation, that's one thing. But what happens if we're dealing with ISIS and the person's holding a large knife in his hand to somebody's throat? Do you approach manslaughter the same way? You're dealing with a totally different animal. So here, when dealing with a super predator, when it comes to sexual victimization, We have to understand that we cannot and we dare not have misplaced priorities, because people's lives are on the line. This is something, if someone is sexually violated, they will carry that with them the rest of their lives. I recently heard of someone who is in their late 50s, early 60s, and she recently uttered the words about her perpetrator, who has since passed away, and his family member. Why did he hate me so much? Well, how do you describe to that person? And she's an extremely intelligent individual, but viscerally she feels it was her fault. And this went on day after day for years in her family. So we're talking a lifetime of pain, so we need to get this right. Okay, so we're going to go through this chart. The perpetrator has not become a wolf by accident. Again, super predator. So it takes focus, being very purposeful and aware. These individuals are extremely focused, yet they come across as being very mild-mannered. The typical person cannot believe that there's someone that has become so depraved, so twisted, so deviant, that like a white shark or like a wolf, these folks are hell-bent on continuing to hunt for victims. Jimmy, you want to say anything about that?
Well, I would add to that. You know, in interviewing some people in different prisons, you find out that these people, their behavior intensifies in prison. I think the general knowledge is, or the general assumption, I should say, because it's not knowledge, it's an assumption, is that when they get to prison, they're so broken over what they've done, and now they've been caught, and the gig is up, and they're going to therapy, and it's some people have intensive therapy, and John, you facilitated those sessions, and so the assumption is, these are broken people, and they're trying to get their lives right and straightened out, and they're finding Jesus in prison, and it's the exact opposite. The stories that I hear, like the most recent one, these guys are writing fantasy journals. One guy had written a fantasy journal about violating his own biological daughter, and chronicling what he literally did to his daughter and what he was charged on, and then he's selling that to other inmates for profit. And these guys are masturbating to this novel of this guy chronicling abusing his own biological daughter. So if we think they're remorseful and they're sitting and they're so sorry over what they've done, we're fooling ourselves.
That's right. And Jimmy, you did reference that for over 11 years, I dealt with these kind of folks in prison. And cannot tell you, during intensive treatment, which that is a misnomer, there is no intensive treatment in prison. And I will challenge any psychology staff member, and that was my role, there is no intensive treatment. They may call it high intensity. That's just a duration of time, but here's high intensity and low intensity. I'll give you the difference. For instance, low intensity is a single 2-hour group each week for a year. That's low intensity. High intensity is a single 2-hour group for 2 years. Without any individual.
2 hours in what is that 2 hours a day? Is that 2 hours a week? What's that time frame?
That is per week.
Okay.
Now there is what's called a therapeutic community. I ran a therapeutic community. Pennsylvania had 2. They now have 1. I was in charge of 1 for a year. And that was per day. So a single group per day in the most intensive environment. Quite frankly, it's an absolute joke what's going on. And don't get me started on that. We'll continue. But no, these men are not remorseful. In 11 years, I have never come across one super predator, and we're talking about those that prey on prepubescent children. There was never one, in my estimation, that was remorseful and repentant. It was all a facade because they've crossed too many lines and they've hardened their heart. So on that note,
go back into the presentation. John, I have a question too. I don't know that I've ever asked you this, or if I did, I don't remember the answer. But of these super predators that that we're talking about in prison, how many of those were religious folk, or did you not have insight into their into that part of their prison life?
Yeah, excellent question, Jimmy. I would say the majority of the most dangerous super predators were older, and they had a religious background. A good portion of them attended church on a regular basis, and of that portion, it was not uncommon to find that they held a position of church leadership. One person.
Yeah, and that's the more we consult with churches, almost always now, I'd say 90% of the time when we get requests to check out allegations of abuse, about 90% of the time we can almost guarantee that the alleged abuser is in some form of church leadership. That's almost a given now.
That's right. Okay, we'll continue with the slide here. So number one, they're very focused. It takes work and energy. Again, by the time something comes to light, something within us wants to give these folks the benefit of the doubt. We cannot have misplaced sympathies. These folks exercise a tremendous amount of effort and energy in trying to make sure that they have access to kids, and that they've been able to work the crowd. They've been able to work things for such a long period of time that they eat, drink, and breathe their next victim. Jimmy, any thoughts?
Completely agree. There is the more I read letters from Dad and just hear what contact he has with victims of his, and he's still contacting victims from prison. He's still, and he taunts and torments and masks that in his concern. It's anything but concern, because I hear back the types of things that he's writing them. And when he asks for pictures, which, by the way, and John will tell you this, sex offenders are not allowed any pictures of any minors, clothed or unclothed, when they're in prison. And that is a very serious charge if a pedophile is caught with, they call it contraband, but photographs of any minor. But that doesn't stop my dad from obsessively writing pictures and asking for pictures not of his own children, but of his grandchildren. And it's interesting to me, he's never once asked for any pictures of any adults, ever. He's been incarcerated now for 5 years, and multiple times he's not only written me, he's written guilt trips about, you're robbing me of the joys of ever seeing my grandkids grow up. So he writes these guilt trips for things that he's not even allowed to have, but he's obsessed with it. But then he, when he sees that we won't release pictures of our own kids, he starts writing other people. He writes church members. I've had several church members come up to me and say, your dad's writing me all these letters from prison, just begging for pictures of your kids. And so, unfortunately, I have no doubt that he has people feeding him pictures of my kids, from just pulling them from Facebook and different places. So that's what we're talking about. They obsess about it. They fantasize. It consumes every thought.
And it's hard for someone who is not deviant to even conceptualize this. But again, these are not, it's, for instance, maybe the closest thing we can liken this to, but again, alcoholism can be, quote unquote, an individual issue, but it's always, it affects everybody. If someone speaks in terms of an alcoholic, what comes to mind? Somebody with a brown paper bag sitting in on a curb? Or could we actually believe that somebody could be a functional alcoholic while holding office, while working at a very respectable job? Again, that's with alcoholism or drug addiction. This is deviance at its lowest and darkest level. It's likened to Judas. How often do we think that Judas thought about money? Probably all the time. Nobody noticed it. Nobody knew it. But Judas never perpetrated upon a child. So again, total focus. We'll go on to the next one. It takes deviance. These folks, we wanted to add one other piece. Again, this is not by accident. This is not porn addiction. Porn addiction, though, you watch a porn addict and they're thinking about it all the time. It has ensnared them. This is very different because the pathway into child perpetration takes much more work as far as violating and hardening and deadening a conscience. Romans 1 talks about people are given over, but that's talking about even adults with adults. This is a totally different level. We referenced dark porn. There is a realm of pornography, probably the closest that unfortunately a lot of people are aware of. I do not recommend anybody read this. Focus on the Family did an excellent program about 50 Shades of Grey. Okay, when you're talking about bondage, when you're talking about somebody electing to subject themselves to that which was used in the Middle Ages to extract information, and suddenly that's sexually arousing, that's pretty bizarre, but it takes it to a new level. These individuals, the super predator, also, their gateway is fantasy games, fantasy online types of programs that the average person never would even conceptualize. I had worked with perpetrators for 10 years before I really started to be able to interview guys without their awareness, so to speak, of why I was asking them the questions. And to hear that you have, sitting across the table, I'm talking to an adult man who indicated he loved portraying on the screen a fluffy little animal. And then it degenerates from there. Well, how do you explain that? This person has been given over, and so that is one of the pathways. These fantasy interactive games, and that's how they snare these kids, but then their little character starts to get into the most heinous of things, and then they also get into dark porn.
Yeah, I would add to that too. We think of child pornography in terms of, I've seen church leaders be incredibly sympathetic to people because they say they just got caught up. And I've come to hate that term. They got caught up in it. No, they didn't get caught up in it. They were completely wrapped up in it. And child pornography is, the dark porn that John's talking about is completely different, as he referenced it, completely different from consumerism pornography. Child pornographers don't view child pornography. They trade and sell child pornography. So what they do is they'll segment the pornography in chapters. And so, for example, the people who are actually filming the abuse, they film the abuse in kind of dangling the carrot in front of the nose of the consumers. And so they'll film it, or they'll take pictures in sequential order. And so chapter 1 might be leading into this fantasy and the child undressing, and then they stop the video. And then it's not until you've purchased or have traded part 1 that pornographer number 2 then trades part number 1 of him abusing his child. And so once that trade is handed off, then pornographer number 1 will release part 2, and vice versa. And so back and forth this goes. And so it becomes this bizarre fantasy that's a level that you just can't even comprehend how twisted it is.
That's right. And again, it's so important for people to understand that by day, again, the super predator, what we're talking about, especially within the church, is by day, we think these folks are normal. We think these folks are reasonable and respectable and nice and the sweetest people you'll ever meet. But once their secret life, and the only reason it's secret is not because they are ashamed, they have no shame. And isn't that exactly what the Bible speaks to? They have passed beyond the ability to have any shame, and now they hunger and thirst after unrighteousness. So there is no shame, but they get access to their victims by positioning. We're talking that's torture type of stuff. Jimmy, I think we lost our.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out.
And that's okay. I'll just kind of walk. I'm aware of the time, so I'll walk us through the rest of the gradation.
Can you?
Then you're going to get into fantasy stuff. Those of us that are not into that, we can't relate to someone that actually wants to create this persona and create a world that also is sexually charged. That just does not happen. Then you add on top of that the fact that you are hurting another individual, and then it starts to move towards not just hurting another individual, but now you're degrading, now you're taking innocence, and eventually you are marring and you are defacing. And that's probably the best way to put it. You are actually defacing that which is most innocent. And that's why it goes well beyond power and control. It goes well beyond sexual. This is not about sexual impulse. This is about the desire to remove innocence. And that's why it's the most heinous of all types of offenses, as far as what the super predator does. Jimmy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm getting an echo here for some reason, but yeah, I again completely agree, and I think other people who work with these kinds of guys, and certainly in the prison settings, everybody I've spoken to, they talk about this. This consumes them. Even in prison, these guys are striking up relationships with other pedophiles. Strangely, they create these sexual relationships with other predators, and it's just this bizarre thing where sexual deviance is the norm, and they're going to get it one way or the other. If not with the child, they're going to get it with another man, even if they're not a homosexual. They may not be a homosexual. That may not be their preference, but because they're so morally degraded and methodical and strategic, and they can't get a child, and they know they're not going to get a child again, they start having these sexual relationships with each other. Or if they don't do it with another man in prison, which happens quite often, they'll do it with a prison employee. And Anna Salter has a whole chapter on that in her book on predators that is just brilliant, and she speaks to that. And my experience from talking to other people who've worked in prisons is that's very much true. It's the dirty little secret, is that these guys are going to get deviant sex, period. They're going to find it one way or the other, and they will not stop until they get it.
Right. I'm aware of the time, Jimmy, so
yeah.
We'll really bring this to a close. Why don't I allow you to close us, and we'll be back at the, as a matter of fact, what is the date that we're back next month?
Yeah, it'd be the first Wednesday of next month, whatever that date is, in December.
There you go, Pearl Harbor Day.
You can't see me, can you? For some reason, my camera went out.
No,
so
but we can.
Here's my closing remark.
There you go.
Church Protect does not have a lot of money, so
that's good.
So I'm working on this laptop is I think it's 6 years old now, maybe 7, and I've been having more and more issues with it. I cannot afford a laptop, and we need technology to keep producing materials. And we have a staff of, well, you're pretty much looking at it. And then we have, of course, Alex, our Director of Survivor Support Services. So that's my closing remark. If you want to help, that's a great place to start. But we also need people to share our resources. And if you find them useful, help us to find some funding to be able to replace aging equipment. And we we don't want to charge for any services to survivors. The last thing survivors should be doing is scrambling to find money for how they're going to pay for our services. So everything we do for them is completely free for them, but it's not so free on our end. So the only way we can make that happen is through the generosity of other people.
There you go. Well, thank you one and all for tuning in, and we will see you next time on December 7th.
Yep. Thank you all for watching.